And action.
A leader of a revolutionary party was refusing the removal of bucket toilets in Ekurhuleni because that person is the one who's supplying bucket toilets and is a leader of a revolutionary movement. When we pushed, they said, no, Floyd wants to destroy my business.
SOEs were deliberately brought to their knees so that a new trick called Operation Vulindlela could be hatched. Nivulela batseshi indlela. You are opening the privatization path for the rich elites to consolidate their wealth to the continued exclusion of the masses of our people.
Broad-based black economic empowerment, B-BBEE, serves as a Trojan horse to undermine genuine black economic empowerment. The allocation of 30% ownership stakes to politically connected elite within government has incentivized the sabotage of state-owned enterprises. This facilitates the transfer of these assets to private entities, often linked to white monopoly capital, at reduced value. When the ANC assumed power, it relied on consultants tied to established economic interests. These consultants embedded mechanisms within B-BBEE that preserved existing power structures while appearing to advance transformation. This allowed connected elites to benefit disproportionately, while state assets were undermined, raising questions about the policy's true beneficiaries. Underinvestment and mismanagement have left state assets underperforming, that's deliberate neglect to enable privatization. While the leasing of these assets to private entities is underway, often justified as a means to improve efficiency and reduce costs. The reliance on consultants tied to established economic interests during the ANC's early governance shaped policies in ways that preserved existing power structures. Let's use SAPO as an example. The ANC and its ally, the Communication Workers Union, CWU, part of COSATU, are essentially one entity and deliberately allowed the 2014 South African Post Office, SAPO, strike to continue, undermining SAPO to benefit private couriers. UNISA, a state-owned university, outsourcing the delivery of study materials to private couriers during the 2014 South African Post Office, SAPO, strike, led by COSATU's Communication Workers Union, CWU, illustrates a flawed system where state-owned enterprises, SOEs, rely on private couriers. SOEs continue to use private couriers. It's illogical for state entities like UNISA to outsource to private firms instead of using SAPO. B-BBEE enriches WMC, enabling SOE takeovers through outsourcing and corruption, with the ANC and CWU allowing SAPO's collapse to benefit private firms. The ANC and CWU, as allies, could have stopped the 2014 SAPO strike but allowed it to persist, costing 2.1 billion rands and enabling outsourcing to private couriers, a WMC-linked courier with 25 to 30% B-BBEE shares held by African elites with no control. Couriers won, profiting from our 1.3 billion in irregular tenders, SIU, 2015, while WMC and ANC-connected elites benefited, as Zondo confirms with SAPO's are 2.7 billion in corruption. There's a direct link between the failure of South African state-owned enterprises, SOEs, like SAPO, Eskom, and RAF, the removal of competent African managers such as Matshela Koko, Eskom, Collins Letsoalo, RAF, and Brian Molefe, Eskom, Transnet, and privatization driven by white monopoly capital, WMC, and B-BBEE fronting, which benefits ANC-connected elites with nominal shares. What do you think? Drop your comment below, let's get the nation talking.
Brian Molefe managed to stop load shedding, President. And for more than 540 days, South Africa forgot what load shedding is. It was to return in May 2018 when new president started preaching a new dawn, which has proved to be a long night. We experienced up to level 6 load shedding until 2024 when the Android director left. The CEO who had been hired by this administration, he was actually writing a book instead of running Eskom. In 2018, when Transnet was glorious and on the ascent, it carried 226 million tons on its railways and made a profit of 5 billion rand. Today, after this administration had to create a business case for what it would term state capture, again bringing the butcher of SOEs, who ejected all the skilled personnel, Transnet was brought to its knees and could only carry 151 million tons last year and a staggering loss of 7 billion rand. This is 35% less than it carried during the glorious years of 2017-2018. 2 days ago, Transnet was downgraded by Standards & Poor. And they cited that it is unlikely to meet the target tonnage that it had set for itself. On the 22nd of February 2018, SARS reached the 1 trillion mark for the third consecutive year under Commissioner Moyane, and yet a judge was hired to rubbish all the achievements he had made. That is the nature of New Dawn South Africa. Successful black executives who have backbones and refuse to be assimilated are identified, tainted, harassed, and humiliated so that no black child can have a positive role model. Today, lies are being told, but the numbers do not lie. SOEs were deliberately brought to their knees so that a new trick called Operation Vulindlela could be hatched. Nivulela batseshi indlela. You are opening the privatization path for the rich elites to consolidate their wealth to the continued exclusion of the masses of our people. According to its own documents, the Presidency and Treasury have used Operation Vulindlela to fast-track the corporatization of the National Ports Authority, vertically separate Transnet Freight Rail, formalize the National Transmission Company of South Africa, restructure the Eskom grid, and create PSP units housed in the DBSA and water boards, all outside the scrutiny of Parliament. In other words, it is a project that outsources state power, re-engineers public ownership, and neutralizes public accountability through reform milestones, and asserts privatization as the panacea for all of the country's economic ills. As an example, and this is by no means exhaustive, the vertical separation of Transnet Freight Rail is ill-advised. Breaking up of a network industry whose costs remain low as a result of economies of scale, where fixed costs can be spread proportionally based on more volumes carried by rail, will result in higher costs to consumers. However, the Presidency is hell-bent on selling the country's crown jewels and will even do so without a proper business case which would have informed it that the lack of densification of commodities in the rail space militates against breaking freight rail at this point. Private companies will have to charge more as the rail infrastructure provider's source of income will shift to access fees. By 2029, this government will have to subsidize the Transnet Freight Rail Infrastructure Manager upwards of 30 billion rand per annum. And like British Rail, we will recognize the folly of this premature move later. This has not been provided for in the budget simply because the consultants are less than frank when providing advice to government. Whether it is at water boards or at Eskom or Transnet, there is no substitute for placing competent boards of directors and competent managers to lead the business and then drive the correct KPIs to meet societal expectations. Eskom has proved that with a competent chairperson and board, as well as recruiting knowledgeable CEO skills in the form of Dan Marokane, the entity can be turned around swiftly. This country does not need Operation Vulindlela. Izimboni zombuso sezithengiselwa labo abangenankosi, labo abangenaso isilo. The Operation Vulindlela process was not publicly debated in this House. It was introduced in the back door and repeated many times that people who do not know what it is will easily say, we remember the word, but they do not know what the program is. It was not subjected to socio-economic impact assessments. No business cases exist that have been publicly scrutinized, except data from sweetheart consultants who were hired to drive transfer of state assets into private hands. This is a neo-colonial and neoliberal agenda with a high price to pay for the country in the future. And we do not say that there are no industries that would benefit from privatization, but wholesale privatization as driven by Operation Vulindlela undermines the state's ability to drive economic growth through state-led investment and creating a responsible developmental state. The Vulindlela process is privatization by stealth, hidden in plain sight. It is administered through the National Treasury and Presidency-sponsored TBSA PSP unit and informed by consultants paid through undisclosed contractual mechanisms.
There are people who, by the way, still believe that the ANC is a liberation movement. There are people who still believe that. When all evidence is laid bare that this is not a liberation movement, it's an instrument in the hands of our colonizers. It's used for entrenchment of white privilege and white wealth. The biggest beneficiaries, the people who benefited the most from 1994 up until now, is the white capitalist establishment. White people got richer and richer in the first 30 years of so-called democracy. A leader of a revolutionary party was refusing the removal of bucket toilets in Ekurhuleni because that person is the one who's supplying bucket toilets and is a leader of a revolutionary movement. When we pushed, they said, no, Floyd wants to destroy my business. And you know the bucket toilets, how humiliating they are. Those toilets, they get full with excrement, with human waste. And there is no honeysucker that comes to collect those things. But someone says, no, that is his business. We have got revolutionary leaders when there is resolution on insourcing of workers, insourcing of security guards. But they line up security companies so that the municipality pays them 20,000 rand per security guard. And they give that security guard 3,000 rand. And they don't see anything wrong with that.
That's a wrap, folks. But before you go, keep this in mind. Their smoke and mirrors are just theatrics, pulling your focus from what truly matters. The real fight? It's always been about the land and the economy. Stay sharp, stay woke, and we'll catch you next time.
The most important person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation to come. Steve Jobs.